I've got a wood storage problem. So today, we're going to turn this into this. I really thought that would work. If you are a beginner woodworker out there, you will hear a bunch of different takes on how to build your first workbench, or the ultimate workbench. Some people will say not to use 2x4s, but for true beginners, I recommend them. For starters, they're readily available to almost anyone, relatively cheap, and it is what I used for my first workbench years ago. But it's not just me. Big names like Rex Kruger use 2x4s and 2x6s in their workbenches too. And as we get into it, depending on how you build it, 2x4s can add a ton of strength to your bench. After all, they're used to hold up your home. At 8 feet long and over 2 feet deep, I'm building a pretty massive workbench over here. Depending on your shop or garage setup, you might not have the space for something of this size. But if you do, and you want to follow along exactly, I'll give you the breakdown of the materials that I used. For my build, I needed 12 8-foot long 2x4s that would form the shelving and support structure of the build, along with 3 8-foot long 2x6s for the legs and additional supports, 1 8-foot 1x4, a half sheet of 1/4 inch plywood, and 1 sheet of 3/4 inch plywood or melamine, which brings us to our first essential upgrade in my opinion. Using a surface like melamine for the top of your workbench is essential if you're ever going to be gluing on the bench. There's no risk of any glue spills seeping into the top. You can just wipe them off before they dry, or after drying just give them a quick scrape with a sharp edge to fleck it off. Melamine is a quick and cheaper solution, but if you're feeling fancy, you can opt to laminate the top of a sheet of regular plywood, but more on that later. Diving back into the build, I started by breaking down the 2x4s and 2x6s I bought into appropriate lengths, and then I began laying out and assembling what would become the lower 2 shelves of my workbench. I mentioned drawing from home construction inspiration here to add strength to our build, and what I meant by that is to build our shelving with our 2x4s oriented on edge vertically, like how you would see floor joists or roof rafters. This orientation provides structural benefits that will allow these lower shelves to hold a lot of weight, which is good because, as you saw in the beginning, I have a bit of a wood storage problem, and I'm hoping to fix that with this workbench. I went ahead and used a Forstner bit to recess the holes where I would be putting in screws to assemble these shelves. This is completely optional and purely aesthetic, so if you don't have a Forstner bit, don't worry about it. But by recessing the holes, I'm making it so that I can come back later with dowels and cover up the screw heads for a cleaner look. If you are enjoying this build and these tips, please like the video or subscribe to our channel. It really helps us out, and it ensures that you don't miss out when we release future builds or new plans. I repeated the process for my second shelf, making sure that the support stud layout was identical to the first. I then moved on to mounting my legs. Now standard countertop height is 36 inches, and that feels right to me for all of my workbenches, so I needed to make my legs 32 inches tall. I also went ahead and staggered the orientation of my legs on the front and back sides of the bench. I did this firstly because I wanted to maximize the opening space in the front of my workbench, but also, similar to why we oriented the support struts on edge, changing the leg orientation reinforces the whole structure in both directions so it is less likely to flex and bend. I cut some handy spacer blocks to position on top of my bottom shelf and ensure that my second shelf was evenly spaced upwards. I then carefully slipped my second shelf over my legs and onto the spacer blocks. Once it was in position, I screwed the whole thing together. The spacer blocks also add another layer of support for the second shelf so that the weight isn't loaded just onto the screws mounting into the legs. Some people are bound to say that I should have put a vertical support in the front center to keep the second shelf from bowing. But I went ahead and tested standing on the shelf myself and saw minimal deflection. If I can stand directly in the center without issue, then I'm not too concerned about the wood that I put on the shelf that will be distributed more evenly. You may be wondering why, if I wanted to make my workbench 36 inches tall, I only cut the legs to 32 inches. Well, I'm glad you asked, because that brings us to our second workbench essential upgrade, casters or wheels. In a small shop, space is always at a premium, so having the ability to move equipment and workbenches around is a must. Now, casters aren't perfect for all setups. If you're going to be hammering away at a piece with a chisel, it's best to have 4 sturdy feet on the ground to keep the workbench from moving. But if your shop is small, even in those situations, I would recommend a set of wheels. There are sets out there that allow you to have your workbench sturdy on the ground, but then when you engage the caster, it lifts the whole bench up, allowing you to wheel it around. In my case, I went with a heavy-duty set of locking casters rated to handle all of the wood and tools I was planning to put on this bench. Once all the casters were installed, I built up the outside edge of my top. Now this is the same shape as the bottom 2 shelves of the bench, but we are going to do something a little different with the support struts in the middle. But before I get into that, I went ahead and mounted the top outer rim to the rest of the workbench. I found it easiest to flip the bench upside down and slide it onto the top to get everything flush for mounting. With that mounted, I flipped things back over and began putting in the support struts. Now, unlike the lower shelves, for the top, I oriented the struts on the face for 2 reasons. The first was that this gives an easy surface to drill through to mount the plywood or melamine. And the second reason was that I further reinforced things underneath these 2x4s with 2x6s mounted on edge. Those 2x6s then extended down past the front edge of my top shelf, which enables us to mount our third and final essential upgrade for this workbench: drawers. I find you always need more drawers in the workshop, especially at your workbenches. They hold all the small tools and items that you need, and if you have too few of them, they quickly become overcluttered and hard to find anything within them. During the process of organizing my shop more, I have started to pay closer mind to what items go in what drawer, keeping the things that I need in the drawer closest to where I will need them. For instance, this workbench is going to hold both my drill press and my little lathe, so having bits and carving tools in drawers within this bench makes the most sense. But before we could move on to building the drawers, it was time to put the final few bits on the body of my workbench. I quickly cut down some dowels and hammered them in to cover up all my screw holes on the front side of my bench. I didn't bother with the back ones, as where I have this plan to be positioned, they will be out of sight. And if that ever changes, I can come back and plug those too. I then cut down a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood. One reason I chose 8 feet as the length of my bench is because it would then perfectly fit a single sheet of plywood lengthwise. So with regards to the top, let's take a few moments to talk about the Formica laminate versus melamine options that we have for you. If you're at all intimidated by Formica or the cost is a concern to you, by all means, I recommend going with melamine. It's cheaper and it's going to give you all the same functionality that I was talking about that you want, where glues and spills will be an easy cleanup, things will slide, and you'll have a nice clean surface on it. The main reason I didn't go with melamine for this build is actually just because my big box store that's local didn't have any 4x8 sheets of melamine available. And so my options were to either pay for a delivery cost, which I didn't want to do, or for just a little bit more of the melamine plus the delivery fee, I was able to get the Formica and plywood that I wanted, and then I got the nice black clean surface that I already have elsewhere in my shop. But if you're nervous or cost is a concern, once again, go with the melamine. With the glue for the dowels dried, I gave them a quick flush cut, then sanded the whole frame, and it was ready for finish. Now, this is in the workshop, and is likely to be beat up and worn down. I didn't want to spend a bunch of time on some fancy finish. I debated painting the piece, but none of the other furniture in my shop is painted, so I was hesitant to do that. What's something quick, cheap, and easy that will make these 2x4s really stand out? Let's light this baby up. Now, the Japanese have a method dating back to the 18th century called what I believe is pronounced Shou Sugi Ban. It preserves wood through charring it. I'm not doing anything that intense, but in experimenting on a few pine projects in the past, I've found a light charring makes the grain really pop. With the wood charred to my level of preference, I went ahead and mounted the plywood top to the bench. I got everything in position, clamped it in place so it wouldn't move, and then drove screws into it up through the top 2x4s that we positioned horizontally on face. I touched up the front edge of the plywood to match the bench frame, and then it was time to switch gears over to building the drawers. If you keep your drawers an appropriate height, I went with 5 inches, then you should have enough leftover 3/4 inch plywood or melamine to build the box frames for the 3 drawers like I did. I ripped down 5-inch wide strips lengthwise on the plywood sheet offcut, and then used the miter box to cut them to the appropriate dimensions to fit between the 2x6s we mounted underneath the top of the workbench. Now I'm routing a 1/4 inch dado in all the sides of my drawer boxes to be able to slide the 1/4 inch plywood in to form the drawer bottoms. You can do this on a router or on your table saw. If you don't have those, or feel uncomfortable doing that, you can always opt to build your drawer bottoms out of thicker plywood and just screw them into the sides of the drawer. I've done this on drawers in the past. Bear in mind though, this will likely require you to buy another sheet of plywood. I'm also going to be using pocket hole screws to assemble these drawers. If you don't have those tools, then you can just pre-drill and screw from the outside of your drawer box. Keep in mind that you want your screws, no matter which method you are doing, to be perpendicular to the axis of motion when you are opening and closing the drawers, as this will prevent the screws from stripping out later on down the road. I jumped over to the table saw and cut some scrap 1/4 inch plywood I had down to size for the bottoms. For assembly, I like to mount the face of the drawer to both sides, flip everything to be laying on the front face down, then slide my bottom into position on the dado I cut. It's then usually pretty easy to position the back onto the drawer and screw it into place. Unfortunately, these offcuts of 1/4 inch plywood had been sitting in my shop for quite a while, and it seemed like the humidity had caused them to expand a little bit. So it was quite a tight fit for the dado slot, and I had to hammer the back piece into position. Moving past that little slip, I clamped the back of my drawer in position and screwed it in place. I jumped over to the workbench and began to mount my drawer slides to the 2x6 struts. For positioning the slides, I temporarily tacked up a piece of scrap wood to rest the slides on with some pin nails, and then I just removed the piece once the slides were in place. I then went ahead and repeated all these steps for my other 2 drawers, thinking I would just knock off the assembly quick and then get a nice shot of mounting all the drawers in sequence. The 1x6 of material that we purchased is for the drawer fronts, and to keep with the aesthetic of the bench, I took it outside for a quick torching. Now, a quick tip here when cutting the piece is to measure for the lengths of all of your drawer fronts, and then cut them in sequence so that you can get a nice single flowing grain match across the piece. From the distance, this makes it so that it can still look like a single piece of wood. For mounting the drawer fronts, there are specialty clamps out there made specifically for the task, but most of the time they can be tedious and unnecessary. If this were some fancy piece for a customer, I would consider them. But given that this is just for the shop, the quick and easy method to mount them is to use wood glue and then tack them in place with pin nails. You can then reinforce with screws drilled in from the inside of the drawer. In the past, I used to mount my drawer handles measuring for each hole with the tape measure and then freehanding everything with a drill. I was pretty accurate, but I would say 1 in 5 times I was just a hair off, and it was a pain to get the bolts aligned with the handle. Getting a cabinet hardware jig got rid of all the mistakes and drastically sped up this whole process. It's one gadget that I would recommend. I personally went with the Kreg jig, as I like the compact style and how quick and easy it is to position everything. Since I was going the Formica laminate route for the top, I went ahead and sanded the plywood to give it an even and smooth finish. For laminate, you want to make sure that the plywood base you use is smooth and flat. If there's too much texture or roughness to the wood surface, you run the risk of that unevenness bleeding through and being able to feel it through the surface of the laminate. For many woodworkers out there, laminate can seem a little intimidating. I know it was for me at first, but with a little know-how, it's really not that complex. First tip I can give you is when you cut your laminate, you want to leave it a little oversized for the work surface you're adhering it to. This makes it so you don't have to perfectly line up all the sides when you first put it down, which is going to be important because you have to use contact cement. And like the name implies, this stuff fuses together as soon as it comes into contact. My first time cutting laminate sheets, I made a mistake of trying to use a razor blade utility knife to cut through the entire sheet, which led to some scratches where I slipped and some uneven edges when I finally cut through. The real way you should cut laminate sheets is with a carbide scoring knife. I start by marking where I want to cut on both ends of my laminate sheet, then clamping down a straight edge to my cut line. I'm using my Milescraft tracks, but you can use a straight board as well. Remember, we are cutting it oversized, so it doesn't have to be perfect, just close enough. I then run the scoring knife along my edge several times to get a nice evenly scored line across the whole surface. I look for when you break through the top smooth layer of the laminate and you can start to see the rougher material that makes up the backside. Once my score line is good, I move my clamped straight edge back just a hair so that the scored line is exposed, but my piece is still firmly held down to the work surface. And then, it is as simple as bending your offcut upwards and the laminate breaks right at the weak spot along the scored line. With my surface cut, I went to putting on the contact cement on both the plywood top and the underside of the laminate. Another thing to note is that the porous nature of the wood surface can oftentimes absorb a good bit of the contact cement. So I typically like to do a full coat applied to that surface, then let that tack up for 10 minutes or so, and come back and add a thin layer on top just to ensure that there's enough for the laminate to adhere to. For large surfaces like this, I like to use a small offcut of some 1/4 inch plywood as a spreader, wiping contact cement across the majority of the surface. Near the edges, I switch over to a cheap small brush that I don't mind tossing after using. You can usually get these super cheap in multi-packs at $1 or so per brush, and they definitely come in handy. To avoid misalignment of your laminate, it is best to lay down some scrap pieces of wood so that it can be positioned over your bench top but not touching it. Then, starting in the center, you can pull the scrap pieces out one by one and use a roller to firmly press the two surfaces together to bond. This is critical, as if you don't get a good bond on the surfaces, they can delaminate in the future, and you will be left with either an air pocket or a spongy spot in the top. With everything fully cured, the final touch to the top is to trim the excess laminate overhang. I like to use an 1/8 inch roundover bit in my trim router and just run it all along the edge of the plywood. This not only trims the laminate, but it also gives a rounded profile that makes it less likely to snag something on it. Last came the arduous task of clearing out this corner and putting in the new workbench. I hope you enjoyed this build and maybe learned something useful that you can apply to your own. And if you did, we hope that you'll tune in to future Boobless Craft builds.